All right, well, the majority of my comments are for Walter Block's paper, probably because his was the most provocative and gives me the most to maybe react to or against. I'm not necessarily a fan of microfinance. I think Jeffrey Tucker has done great work on Eunice and Grameen Brank, and Walter builds on that to his great credit in his paper. But there are some things about which I still have questions after reading the paper. Walter, he said this a little bit in his presentation and a lot in his paper, that it's a problem that Grameen gives money to women especially, as this is somehow untoward or sexist. Apparently, Walter objects to this in some way, but my gut reaction to that is, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, hasn't charity traditionally, historically, been targeted to women for whatever reason, for perfectly legitimate reasons? We give money to widows and orphans and let men fend for themselves because men should fend for themselves. And with respect to the idea that there's maybe a socialist, feminist agenda at work here, that may be true. I haven't read Eunice's writings in any detail, but I did come across an article by Ronald Bailey in Reason magazine, and I certainly don't consider him to be a more credible source than Walter, but nonetheless, he did listen to a speech by Eunice and did make this comment. He writes, characterizing Grameen's reasons for doing it this way, he writes, the bank concentrates on lending to women because bank research has shown that women tend to have a longer-term planning horizon and spend more business profits on family members than do men. This strikes me, of course, as entirely plausible. I don't know much about Bangladesh, but I can imagine that perhaps the poor men in Bangladesh have very high time preferences and go out and do irresponsible things, and the women are the ones who stay home and who might be more liable to develop a business. Similarly, with microfinance projects in the inner city United States, it's not at all hard to imagine that young men in the inner city United States have very high time preferences. They're out getting put in prison and doing bad things and being wasteful, and who's left but the women who to be responsible to lend the money to? Now, it's interesting that Walter objects not only to Grameen Bank, but also to hypothetical, pure private microfinance, and I have a little trouble understanding that. One objection Walter has in his paper is that supposedly this crowds out legitimate lending to creditworthy people. But it seems to me that this money isn't money that would otherwise be lent to creditworthy people. It's money that would otherwise simply be given away as charity. And what's wrong with giving people a loan instead of giving people a handout? It seems if you give them a small loan with the expectation that they'll pay it back with some guidance that they're going to invest this in some way, and, you know, not everyone's cut out to be an entrepreneur, but certainly people are cut out to be self-employed, I mean, or do small-scale things, running a food cart or whatever it is that you might do in some third world country. So I don't find this as outrageous or inappropriate. Walter did mention that we libertarians should urge sweatshops, not microfinance, and there may be some problems with sweatshops as far as, you know, how these things are set up, whether they're always fully compatible with property rights in the way that these companies come in and get to set things up. And I wonder why Walter didn't mention instead, of course, the approach of someone such as Hernando de Soto, who says, well, no, let's libertarians go in and promote property rights. That seems to me to be the number one alternative to microfinance. So again, overall, I certainly agree with respect to Eunice. There's no question that he's tied in with some unsavory socialist characters and agenda, but I wonder if we can so easily condemn all of microfinance. With Mr. Payne's paper, I liked it. It's well researched, well documented, and I certainly recommend the written paper to you. I mean, everybody here wrote a great paper, but what struck me about his is something that other academic writers, not necessarily on this panel, but in general, could learn from, and that is, it reads very smoothly, it reads like a magazine article, it's something you can sit down and read, and the footnotes are all there, it's all well documented, but it tells a good story at the same time. I had some sort of critiques of the paper, but he kind of corrected them in the presentation. The paper just kind of lists all the poor planning and so forth that was done by this Wilbur Smith and Associates. And as I was reading this, it occurred to me, well, if some bureaucrat looks at this, if some ordinary person looks at this, they're going to think, gee, remind me not to hire Wilbur Smith and Associates when I want to do my central planning. But of course, the problem isn't Smith and Associates. It's the very idea of central planning. And you hit that as soon as you start in this presentation. I think in the final written product, it would be helpful to have that come out even more and bring out even more the points that you brought out in your presentation about how these programs, they're so destructive in tearing up all this existing stuff, then building new roads, and you didn't say this in the paper, but you did say it in your presentation. Then, of course, we have the environmentalists and whoever coming on again to say, no, let's build the tracks all over again. And as long as you have central planning, you'll have all sorts of arbitrary decisions and crazy back and forth. And so if this paper could really hammer home in the end the idea that, look, it's not St. Louis, it's not the interstates, it's any time government tries to decide this stuff, because government can't decide this stuff, I think it would make a really powerful libertarian point. Moving on to Mr. Yasuda's paper, well, of course, libertarians have known for a long time that many intellectuals are bought and paid for by the state, and the reason why there aren't more libertarians and Austrians at top universities probably isn't because we don't do great work. I would say the evidence here suggests that we do great work. The problem is that the intellectuals at the major universities are bought and paid for by the state. And, of course, this paper illustrates that point. It uses kind of a powerful new analogy or evolutionary approach to show how the state infects the intellectual world and how the state continues to enjoy legitimacy, even though it seems obvious to us that it should have no legitimacy. The question that the paper raises for me is, of course, what is the next step? How do we take advantage of our knowledge of the way the state infects the intellectual climate in order to advance our own ideas? I don't have much to add regarding Mr. Luzato's presentation. Obviously, he's on solid ground relying on Mises, Hayek, and Rothbard. I'm struck by, he mentions Henry George, of course, and, I get tired of hearing about Henry George sometimes because I feel like it was refuted so well, so long ago by Murray Rothbard, but of course there are always people trying to bring George back and push these ideas, and they try to push it in Latin America too, I know in particular. They've established, for example, English language schools in Nicaragua, which exist ostensibly primarily to teach Spanish speakers English, but then they also say, oh, by the way, there's this single tax thing, and if you did this, everything would be better in your country. And so it's a pernicious idea, and it keeps coming back, and so it's good to see it being addressed there in the Latin American context as well. So that's all I have.
Thank you.